All right, everybody, welcome back. Today, we're really diving deep into this whole EU cybersecurity thing, specifically NIS2, that directive everyone's talking about.
Yeah. It's a bit of a mouthful,
It
right?
can seem that way,
Yeah.
but stick with us. We're going to break it all down. By the end of this deep dive, you'll know exactly what NIS2 means for you and, more importantly, for your business. No more jargon, promise.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And it's something worth paying attention to, because NIS2 is kind of a big deal.
Right. Big time.
It's like, remember NIS1?
Yeah.
It's the sequel, basically.
Exactly.
Aims to make the entire EU way more resilient to cyber threats, which, let's face it, is pretty essential these days.
Essential is an understatement. It's like
Yeah.
cybersecurity it's not even about if you'll be targeted anymore, it's when, right?
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about it like this. If GDPR, that was us getting our data houses in order.
Okay.
NIS2 is like, all right, we got the house in order, but now we're hiring a full security team, putting up those cameras,
Yeah.
installing those top-notch alarm systems. It's serious business now.
Big time. And you know what? One of the biggest changes, it's who NIS2 actually applies to. Remember, like, back in the NIS1 days, we were talking operators of essential services and those digital service providers.
Right.
Well, NIS2 is like hold my beer because they're introducing these new categories. We're talking essential entities and important entities.
Okay, hold on. I got to say, all these entities are starting to sound like a superhero team to me. But seriously, break it down for us. What's the difference between these, and why should our listeners even care about this?
It's a good point. Don't worry about the fancy names, really. It's about understanding where your business actually fits in and what you need to do. Both these categories, essential entities, E's, important entities, IEs, they both need to, step up their cybersecurity game, right?
Yeah.
But it's the EEs. Those are the ones that are really under the microscope. Think like those super crucial sectors, energy, transport, the ones that keep everything running.
Right, the essentials, yeah.
They've got way stricter reporting requirements, more oversight, the whole 9 yards.
So I'm picturing our listeners right now thinking, okay, I run a small online shop. This doesn't apply to me. Are they right?
Here's the thing. It's not just about being a big SaaS, Even smaller businesses, NIS2 calls them micro-entities, they need to pay attention too.
Really?
Because if you're a key player in your field, even if you're not some giant corporation, you could still fall under those NIS2 rules.
We're talking about how critical your business is here.
Yeah.
Like, check this out. Annex 2 of the directive, it lists other critical sectors, and you might be surprised to see waste management or even food production on that list. Suddenly, cybersecurity is a lot closer to home, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's like realizing your local grocery store is now a critical link in the national food supply chain. Exactly. And here's the thing that keeps a lot of folks up at night. The criteria for actually deciding who's who.
Yeah.
So your sector matters, obviously how big you are, both employee count and D, how much money you make, but then there's this criticality factor, and that could be a bit more,
Objective.
Yeah. So even if you think, no, we're small, we're safe, double check.
Okay, no hiding under the radar for our listeners then. They'll know if NIS2 applies to them. Now, let's talk about what it actually requires. What are we really talking about here?
Let's get into it. So now we're getting to the good stuff.
Oh, the good stuff.
The nitty-gritty. This is where NIS2 really gets into, what you actually need to do to protect yourself.
All right, bring on the nitty-gritty.
We're talking about risk management.
Okay, risk management. I'm already feeling like, where's my coffee? Where's my spreadsheet?
Yeah, I hear you. It sounds a little intense, but really, NIS2 lays out these minimum security measures. Think of it almost like a cybersecurity checklist. It's about being proactive.
Okay, so not just reacting after something bad happens.
Exactly. So before we get into the thick of it, any guesses what might be on this checklist?
Well, I'd imagine strong passwords. Probably.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd have those.
Multi-factor authentication, keeping your software up to date, that's all in there.
Okay, so basic cyber hygiene, we'll call it.
Exactly. Cyber Hygiene 101. But NIS2, it goes deeper than that. We're talking about supply chain security, how you manage your vulnerabilities, encryption. It's really about looking at your whole operation through that cybersecurity lens.
Okay, so you said vulnerability management. Now, to me, that sounds like I need a computer science degree to even understand what that means. What does that actually look like for our listeners?
Yeah, it's a fancy term, but basically think about it this way. Even the strongest castle, right? It can still have a loose brick somewhere or a hidden tunnel that no one knows about. Vulnerability management is about finding and fixing those things before someone else does.
Before the bad guys get in.
Exactly. And here's a thought that always blows my mind. Over 90% of cyber incidents involve, some kind of human error.
90%.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So even if we have all the fancy tech, all the software, if someone clicks the wrong link, that's it.
Yeah. It's often that simple, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's why training, making sure everyone's aware, it's so important. Oh, and another little detail that I found interesting, NIS2 actually says you need to have specific policies about cryptography and encryption. So even if someone does get their hands on your data, it's locked down.
Oh, so it's like double bagging it.
Exactly. It's like having that extra layer of protection.
Okay, so it's not just preventing the attack, it's also about damage control if it does happen.
You got it. And that actually brings us to our last, but definitely not least, requirement area, and that is business continuity.
Okay, business continuity. So is that just like having a backup plan for when things go wrong?
That's a great way to put it. It's making sure your organization can keep running, or at least get back up and running quickly if there's a cyber incident. Think about things like, how do you recover your systems? What emergency procedures do you have in place? Do you have a crisis response team? Like, are you ready to weather that storm?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I'm sure there are listeners out there thinking, okay, well, what if my business is in multiple EU countries? Does that make it more complicated?
You're thinking ahead. That's good. Jurisdiction. Yeah, it can be tricky. So here's the gist. NIS2, it basically says you got to follow the rules of the country where you're mainly doing business. But if you're active in multiple places, you got to make sure you're playing by the rules in each one of those countries too.
So no taking shortcuts just because you've got multiple rule books to juggle.
Nope.
Speaking of rules, what happens if someone just ignores all of this? Can they just pretend they didn't get the NIS2 memo?
Ignoring NIS2 is kind of like ignoring a fire alarm. Not a good idea. The consequences, they could be pretty serious.
Okay, like what? Give us the worst case scenario.
Fines.
Yeah.
And not just like a little slap on the wrist. We're talking potentially millions of euros, depending on how bad the violation is and obviously how big your organization is.
Millions. Okay, all right, I'm listening.
So for those essential businesses, those providing those super critical services we talked about, the fines, get this, they can go up to 10 million euros.
10 million.
Or 2% of your global annual turnover, whatever's higher.
Ouch. That's going to leave a mark.
Yeah. And even if you're an important entity, not quite as critical, you're still looking at potentially up to 7 million euros or 1.4% of your global turnover.
Okay, so it's not just about the money, though, right?
Right. There could be other legal issues. Your reputation could take a hit. You could even have your business operations suspended. The EU is making it clear that cybersecurity is not optional.
Yeah, they're putting their foot down.
Yeah. But it's not just about avoiding fines, right? It's about building a business that's actually more resilient, more prepared for whatever's thrown at it.
Yeah, like peace of mind. You can sleep at night knowing you've done what you need to do.
Exactly. And that kind of like proactive approach, that's what I find so interesting about NIS2. It's not just about, hunkering down and waiting for an attack. It's about actively working together to actually make the whole digital environment safer.
Yeah, I like that collaborative security,
That's
right?
exactly.
Because in the cyber world, no one's really an island.
You got it. And to highlight that point even more, I want to actually zoom in on like the role of the EU itself in all of this, because it's not just about, setting the rules and then just letting everyone fend for themselves. There's real emphasis on like support and shared responsibility.
Right, okay. And one thing that keeps coming up in the research is this whole system of CSIRTs. Are those like the cybersecurity SWAT teams?
Yeah. I mean, they might not arrive in a helicopter or anything,
Right.
but you're on the right track. So basically, each member state, they have their own designated CSIRT. Like it's your main point of contact for handling cybersecurity incidents.
Okay.
So let's say a company, they get hit with a major cyber attack. They would report that to their national CSIRT, and then those guys, they can offer guidance, they can provide support, they'll help coordinate a response to try to contain the damage.
Oh, okay. So it's like having like a cybersecurity safety net, someone to call if you're not sure what to do.
Exactly. But it's more than that. It's not just reactive,
Okay.
CSIRTs, they also gather and share information about threats and vulnerabilities. So it's like everyone's learning from each other's experiences.
So one company's close call could prevent another one from having a full-blown disaster.
Exactly. It's like a cybersecurity hive mind.
The hive mind, I like that.
And to boost this whole like collaborative spirit even more, NIS2's introduced this really cool thing called the European Vulnerability Database.
Okay, vulnerabilities, those are those weak points we were talking about before, right?
Exactly.
So what's this database all about?
Imagine like a central hub where Any new vulnerabilities that are found in ICT products and services, that information gets collected and shared.
Okay.
It's like an early warning system for the whole EU.
Yeah.
So say they find a security flaw in a particular software, right?
Yeah.
That gets flagged in the database, and then other organizations can see it, and they can take steps to protect themselves before it's too late.
So it's like a proactive patching system, making sure everyone's in the loop and can fix those weak points before, the hackers even know about them.
Exactly. And here's another layer to that. NIS2 also encourages what they call coordinated vulnerability disclosure.
Okay, more jargon. Break that one down for us.
What does coordinated vulnerability disclosure actually mean in plain English? Okay, so say a security researcher. They find a vulnerability in a piece of software.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of immediately going public with it, which could be bad news for everyone, right?
Right.
They use this process to report it directly to the company that makes that software.
Oh, okay.
So it gives them a chance to actually fix the issue before everybody knows about it and before, bad actors can take advantage of it.
So it's like giving the good guys a head start.
Exactly.
Make sure they can fix the problem before the bad guys even know about it.
Precisely. And to make sure this whole thing runs smoothly,
Mm-hmm.
NIS2 actually designates specific C-asserts in each country to kind of manage this whole disclosure process.
Okay.
They're like the neutral intermediary, right?
Right.
Making sure the information is flowing where it needs to go,
Mhm.
quickly, securely, all of that.
Okay, so it sounds like they're really trying to create this, structured, organized approach, which is reassuring, I guess, but cybersecurity changes so fast. How can we be sure this whole NIS2 thing can keep up with all those changes?
That is the million-dollar question. And the good news is that NIS2, it's not just set in stone,
Yeah.
It's designed to be reviewed and adapted regularly to make sure it stays relevant.
So it's like a living, breathing document.
Exactly. And that's good because the last thing we want is for it to become outdated and useless.
Okay, so it's adaptable, that's good. But let's get practical for our listeners for a second. Say they've got the NIS2 directive in front of them, they've looked at their own business, they understand what it's asking. How do they even begin to actually implement all this stuff? It's got to feel overwhelming.
It totally is. Like, where do you even start, right? But don't worry, there's a way to make it a little less intimidating. One thing that can really help is breaking down those NIS2 requirements into smaller, more manageable steps, like building blocks.
Okay, yeah, I like that. So instead of looking at this massive fortress we need to build, it's like, all right, let's start with the first brick.
Exactly. So first things first, you got to have really solid cybersecurity policies in place. We're talking about the foundation here.
Policies. Okay, so not just those documents that sit on a shelf and gather dust.
No, these are
Oh.
important. They're like your organization's North Star for cybersecurity. They outline everything. Your approach to managing risk, protecting data, how you're going to handle incidents if and when they happen. It's all there.
So it's like before you even start building, you're drawing up the blueprints, making sure everything's up to code.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But blueprints alone don't get the house built. You need to have clear procedures that bring those policies to life. Those step-by-step instructions for your team, like how do we actually manage passwords? How do we control who has access to what? What do we do if something looks fishy? Turning those big picture principles into like a practical playbook for everyone.
So policies are the what and procedures are the how.
You got it. But here's the thing, and this is where a lot of companies trip up. You can have the best playbook in the world, but if no one's using it,
It's useless.
exactly. So implementation is key. Actually configuring your systems, training your staff, making sure everyone knows what they're responsible for.
So it's like having those fire drills. Everyone needs to know exactly what to do if the alarm goes off.
Perfect analogy. And just like with those fire drills, you need to have regular checkups,
Yeah.
right? Make sure everyone's still remembering what they learned. Make sure those cybersecurity muscles are still strong.
Yeah, it's like ongoing training, right? Like you don't just learn it once and then forget about it.
Exactly. Because things change, new threats pop up, you always got to be adapting. Which brings us to a really important point. Continuous improvement.
Okay, so it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. You can't just check a box and say, okay, we're good on cybersecurity now.
Right, like we're done.
Nope. It's an ongoing process, always reviewing, updating, making sure you're staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
But I know what you're thinking.
What am I thinking?
This probably sounds like a lot for someone to handle, especially if you're a smaller business. Maybe you don't have a whole cybersecurity team, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm sure our listeners are like, okay, great advice, but where do I even start? And how can I afford all this?
It's totally fair. And honestly, you don't have to do it all alone. There's
Yeah.
a ton of support out there. And here's a little secret. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? People have been doing this for a while, so there are frameworks, guidelines, best practices, all sorts of stuff to help you out.
Give us some examples. What are some resources our listeners can actually tap into?
So remember that NIC quick reference guide we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
That's a great place to start. It breaks everything down into plain language, gives you those actionable tips.
Yeah, perfect for getting a grip on the basics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then, let's say you need more specific guidance on something, like how to actually do a risk assessment or how to wrap your head around vulnerability management.
Right, it can get pretty detailed.
It can. So in those cases, check out the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. They're called ENISA.
ENISA,
They've
okay.
got tons of information, publications, training materials, even online tools that can help you figure out where you stand and what you need to work on.
So ENISA, they're kind of like that one-stop shop for everything EU cybersecurity.
Pretty much.
Right.
But don't forget about national resources, too.
Oh, right, because every country kind of has their own thing, right?
Exactly. So, for example, the UK has their National Cybersecurity Center, NCSC. They've got a ton of great guidance, a lot of which applies to NIS, even if you're not in the UK.
Oh, that's helpful. So we've got guidance, but what about the actual tools? Are there any specific ones that our listeners should know about?
It really depends on your specific needs and what your biggest risks are, honestly. But some of the big ones that can make a huge difference: firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, vulnerability scanners. Those are kind of like your cybersecurity all-stars.
Okay, those are familiar names, but just remind us, like, what do those actually do again?
Okay, so imagine your network is like a castle, right?
Okay, I like where this is going.
The firewall, that's your castle wall, controlling who and what can get in and out. Intrusion detection and prevention systems, those are your guards. Patrolling, looking for anything suspicious. And then your vulnerability scanners, those are like those inspectors, going around making sure there are no weak points in your defenses.
I love those analogies. It makes it so much easier to understand. But at the end of the day, the most important thing to protect is the data, right?
100%. And that's where encryption comes in.
Yeah.
It's like putting all your valuable stuff in a vault that's really, really hard to break into. So even if someone does get past your defenses, they can't actually get to the good stuff.
Okay, so layers upon layers of protection.
Layers are key. But we can't forget about the human element. All this tech is great, but you got to have well-trained guards too, right?
Right, because even if the fortress is amazing, if someone forgets to lock the back door.
Exactly. So those regular security awareness programs for your team, that's non-negotiable. Make sure everyone knows how to spot a phishing email, they understand why strong passwords are so important, all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's making cybersecurity everyone's responsibility. Well, I feel like we've covered a ton of ground today. We really unpacked NIS2, talked about what it means for everyone, and even gave our listeners some practical steps to get started.
Yeah, it's been a deep dive for sure. And if our listeners take away just one thing, I hope it's that NIS2, it might seem kind of scary at first, but it's really about all of us working together to make the internet a safer place for everyone.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about building that cybersecurity fortress one brick at a time. So, to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thank you.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay secure.